Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Stravka, for inviting me, of course. I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit different from sort of the themes that have been touched upon so far, at least in the sense that I'm not going to specifically touch upon the ideology of neoliberalism. I'm going to talk more about the other side of the coin, as it were, sort of what has been done in opposition to that over time and across countries. So I'm going to look at it from that point of view. But I'd like to, I'll talk about international movements against neoliberalism. But I'll start first of all by giving you a nice U.S. example, which I think is pertinent and which is a nice, I think, segue for me. And the U.S. example that I'm going to highlight for you, I think, points what, to me, neoliberalism represents in practical and concrete terms. It varies a lot by country, as we've heard before. It has specific ideological characteristics. It has characteristics in terms of its program that vary by country. And in the US, one interesting aspect of that, I think, is educational policy. And with respect to educational policy, of course, this is always in the news nowadays, especially with the Chicago teacher situation. Now they're talking about shutting down some schools, I believe. But I have a nice quote from Du Bois, who is a man that I admire quite a lot. And it occurred to me during dinner last night, I don't know why, there's a collection of nice speeches of his, which is published by Monthly Review. It's basically a collection of different commencement speeches that he gave. And there was one which stuck out to me, and I have some notes on that from a while back, and I think it's very fitting to our discussion here, okay? It was originally delivered as a speech in 1941 at Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, okay? And the whole thing later appears in the Wilberforce University Quarterly. So I'm going to quote a little bit from that because I think it's quite fitting to our discussion here, okay? So I start now. It's significant that the institution whose 75th anniversary, Lincoln University in Missouri, we are celebrating today, arose out of the following circumstances. The soldiers of Missouri, fighting the last battle of the West, spelled the final crippling of the Confederacy, and the idea arose of a systematic education of their fellows in their home state. There was nothing particularly unusual or merely local in this thought and movement. An element of the white South had struggled for a public school system and had sought to follow New England and the West in this direction long before the US Civil War. But it is a needless exaggeration to say that there was, in the confines of the former slave states, south of Mason and Dixon's line, any real state public school system, until the black votes of Reconstruction furnished one. Even in the Midwestern states, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, the public school system did not usually include or envisage black folk. And it was only when Missouri's colored troops saw with their own eyes what had been achieved in Louisiana and Texas that the idea went back to their home state, okay? So he continues, I was brought up in a day where education beyond the grammar school was considered to be a private matter. If a child was to be educated in high school or college, and for the professions, this was a matter to which the private individual and private fortunes should attend. This was the New England counterpart of the English idea of education, which lasted almost down to our day. And conclusion. There grew up consequently in New England endowed high schools and private colleges, which have become the best known in the nation and which long prided themselves on giving training not only to the rich and affluent, but even to the talented children of all classes and races. I remember the first catalog of Harvard University, which I ever saw, had in it a statement, open quote, the experience of the university warrants that no student of ability need leave the institution because of lack of funds, end quote. This situation gradually changed, and the demand for high school and college training on the part of the mass of the youth in the US outran the facilities which private institutions, supported by private endowments, could furnish. And there therefore arose the public town and city high school and state university. The voting masses of America demanded vastly expanded opportunities for learning, end quote there, okay? So I think the point of this part is very important. And it's really to suggest that neoliberalism is a fundamental historical retrogression, okay? It really is in terms of its concrete aspects. It doesn't just go back to the 1970s okay? It's really a pushback to a state which might have even existed if Du Bois is to be believed in the 19th century, okay? So it really cannot be underemphasized how much of a backward step in concrete practical terms, not ideologically, it actually represents. So I want to open with that just to sort of try and, I hope that sort of connects with you, that it relates, it's not only some ideological thing that we're talking about here, it relates to your everyday lives, okay? So what about international movements against neoliberalism, okay? So the international movements against neoliberalism, they're as varied as the neoliberal program themselves. And of course, they depend on the institutional specifics of the particular country that we're talking about. Okay, so there's quite a bit of variation in what an opposition to neoliberalism looks like. Okay, so I'm assuming that you're in opposition. I'm in opposition. I'll just have to say that. Okay. So, in opposition to that means, it's very simple, in fact. It means a few things. First of all, it takes different forms. Two forms which the media likes to feed upon, okay, are what I call structured mass demonstrations, which are kind of the traditional thing we'll see in Paris or in Athens, although of course Athens has also unstructured mass demonstrations, okay, where you have sort of a trade union bloc leading many people in the streets towards the square, and as you go towards the square, there are banners being held which represent the various organizations which represent the mass bloc, right? This is a traditional demonstration. There's a marshal heralding people toward the square associated with each grouping, and it kind of works like that, okay? There are unstructured demonstrations of different kinds, okay? For a recent example of that, you can find actually plenty in the news, okay? But the one which I want to talk about here today, which will give me a transition, okay, is what I like to call the occupation. Okay? It's not, I don't like to call it the occupation. You can think of it as an occupation. And it's an occupation not in any military sense, okay? I'm not talking about that kind of occupation. That's a different definition of the word. It's a different kind of occupation, right? And you see this phenomenon, you can see it in the global south when peasants or marginal farmers, for example, might occupy a plot of land for which the property rights are not exactly clearly defined. That's the thing about property rights, isn't it? They're not always very clear across all contexts who has claim on a piece of land or a stream of income or a share of the aggregate output of a country or whatever you wish to think about. It's not always clear what the claims are, okay? And there's kind of a political struggle around that, okay? It's not determined. Like the Greek example, I think, is a very good one, right? You have, in northern Greece, this struggle over mining, and for reasons which are transparent if you think about it, but perhaps not obviously so, the tourism sector is deprioritized relative to gold, right? The tourism sector is deprioritized relative to the gold sector, okay? So that's a kind of competition which happens between capitalists in which the state sort of may assign a higher degree of priority to one sector over the other in order to arbitrate these property rights. So property rights are not this fixed thing, okay? They're not natural, okay? So the occupation aspect comes in this sort of dance around property rights, I think. Okay, it's kind of a dance around property rights, and the dance can take many forms. So you can have sort of students traditionally in Europe occupying school buildings, or you can have people that sort of just put up, they're not politicized. You go into an abandoned building and you live in it because no one is using it. That's another kind of occupation, which is sort of a kind of dance around property rights. And there can also be occupations of factories and other such things, okay? So the dance around property rights, I contend, I think is sort of a basic aspect of kind of the general program of neoliberalism. I think the dance around property rights is very important. Now, I'm going to talk about that in the context of something else, which I want to start with here. So my involvement here is I'm here basically to talk to you about alternative media initiatives and how they fit into the international movement against neoliberalism. Okay? So I'll talk about two things that I know well, and I'll probably have to be stopped also, and that will come.
Why are you looking at me?
Because you made the refrain good. Okay, so I'll start first with the one in which I've only recently become involved in, and then I'll proceed to the one that I've been involved with a little bit longer. Okay, so the first alternative media project which I got involved with, the basic idea, not chronologically, most recently, the basic idea is that the idea that the newspapers, if you read the newspapers too much, they'll have you loving the oppressor and not the oppressed. Okay, that's a very common idea. Who had that quote? That was Malcolm X, by the way. Okay, that was Malcolm X. And our philosophy was that, look, we have to send some journalists overseas to cover things that are not being covered. And so this project began in about 2008. I wasn't the initiator of it by any stretch. I got on only this past summer, okay? And it was called the Winter Has Its End Project. So the first batch of journalists they sent overseas, they sent them to Nepal after doing a bunch of fundraising. So they raised about $10,000, covered plane, covered lodging, et cetera, and then you ship the journalists overseas. If the mainstream media is not going to do it, we'll do it ourselves online. You click, you send the link to your friends, you gather some money, and there it is, 10,000 bucks. Okay? So that's how that proceeded. And so they went to Nepal, and I only got involved with them in May of this year that just passed. They invited me to go to Greece, okay, for a number of reasons. They wanted an economist along. I also had the pleasure of being their translator most of the time, so there was a practical aspect to that. Okay. And also I had to keep them out of trouble. Because they thought it was funny. For example, this one guy would go around wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt in Ayos Badelimunos, right? Which is a neo-Nazi neighborhood. So they didn't really have much sense also. So I had to keep them out of trouble. Okay? So I tagged along for that, and we maintained a blog which we would update every day. You can go and visit that blog. We had a lot of different kinds of stories. My contributions were economic stories. We sort of interviewed a lot of people that were involved with trade unions, for instance. We interviewed a lot of people that were involved with the election process in June, which was the sort of headline item in June. The Greek elections were going on, okay? And we sort of went and talked to key people involved in different political parties in Greece. That was our thing. We interviewed them. You can find all of these interviews on our website, the link of which is there on the seminar website. And again, we were generally motivated by the idea that, information is something which we have to provide to people because it's not coming out, okay? And that's sort of one aspect, I think, of an opposition to neoliberalism. People sort of don't have a sense of what is happening in very practical, concrete terms and how it affects people. They have some sanitized view which involves a kind of forgetting of things and also not paying attention, I think. We thought that opposition meant dissemination of information. That's all we thought, okay? That's all we thought. The second project I was involved with, I have been involved with for much longer, actually, is a project called Sanhati. And this one is a more established alternative media outlet. It was created in 2007. It started off to be very, very small. Today, we get about 200,000 unique visitors per month. So it's gone from nothing to something. We don't take any corporate funding. Everyone works on a volunteer basis. Okay? If we need to raise money, we raise it from within our collective ourselves. So we ask each other to pitch in if money is needed for a specific project. So we don't take money from any corporations. Okay? And that project is a little bit different in the sense that it has a different geographical focus, but the idea was more or less the same as what we had in the case of the Winter Has Its End Collective. It's basically a group of people that are interested in running an alternative media project to inform a broader audience about things which are objective and based in reality, and which we think are underreported. Okay? We have a very strict editorial process. People submit journalistic articles and theoretical articles all the time. If what you submit to us smacks of falsehood, it goes in the trash. Okay? So that's the basic idea, I think, motivating these alternative media projects, is to create a space where people can sort of come to know what is happening in the world in terms of how is neoliberalism playing out in different countries, and more importantly, from our point of view, what are people doing to oppose? What are people doing to oppose? And this in different countries means very, very different things. In Greece, it means that there's a political party that has sort of now become a player, which before wasn't a player in the elections, and people have started to take notice, okay? In other countries, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that at all. So, depending on how much time I have,
You have more than this.
I have more than that, okay. I want to bring to your attention sort of the thing that's hot right now. The thing that's hot right now. And the thing that's hot right now pertains to the auto, well, there's lots of things that are hot right now, pertains to the auto sector, the development of the auto sector in India, okay? So I want to, I guess if I have 10 minutes or so, I'll give a five-minute thing about the auto sector and our coverage of that, and I'll give you a bunch of numbers since you're into economics, okay? And I'll give you a bunch of numbers about that. And then I'll tell you something about this new union which has developed in response to that, okay? If I can just find my talking points. Okay, here it goes. So the headlines recently were Motown braces for wage revisions, okay? I'm not talking about Detroit here. I'm talking about Delhi. So Delhi has become, and a certain part of Delhi has become one of the most, a growth belt for the auto sector in the world, okay? And it was referring to what is known as the Gurgaon-Manesar auto belt, okay? And that is a part of India in which 80% of the auto sector is concentrated, okay? So 80% of the auto sector has become concentrated there, and recently there's been a lot of reporting with respect to a union which has gone, a lot of its leaders have gone on a hunger strike for 5 days because their union was not recognized. It wasn't over wages, it was just over recognition of the union, okay? So what about the auto industry in India, okay? So let's talk about some basic economic things first, okay? Industrial wage levels, okay? Have they gone up, have they gone down? Do auto workers have the upper hand? And are they grabbing a bigger share of the value added, as Harry had shown you here, okay? The last few years have indeed seen, we've been reporting, labor unrest in the auto and auto parts sector. Most prominently, the most prominent instances are, okay, Mahindra in May 2009 and March 2011, Sunbeam Auto in May 2009, Bosch Chassis in July 2009, Honda Motorcycle in August 2009, okay? And the list is quite a long one, but also Hyundai in Chennai in December 2011 and January 2012, okay? So there's quite a long list of labor unrest in this part of the world. And we thought that we should be covering that because that's our geographical emphasis, okay? And, but you should keep in mind too that unrest is not only limited to the auto industry. What am I doing here for you? I'm giving you an example of sort of the type of coverage we think is underemphasized and bringing to the fore. Okay, these are real things that are happening, they're being underreported, and we think that they should simply be reported. That's all. Have you heard this at all. When you hear about India, what do you hear about? You hear about the growth of the IT sector, et cetera, right? That's what most people think. So I think that this is sort of the type of reporting that an alternative media outlet can be involved in, okay, And so we reported, for example, that unrest is not limited only to the auto industry, although it has been centered there, okay? The auto industry, as I started to mention, has grown very rapidly in the last few years, from 8.5 million vehicles. This includes two-wheelers, three-wheelers, passenger vehicles, and commercial vehicles in 2004. Production has risen to 20.4 million in 2011. Passenger car production has risen to 1.2 million vehicles in 2004 to 3 million in 2010, okay? And the auto industry, in addition to the IT sector, is actually a well-known success story of the rapid growth of the last decade in India. And the government is, in fact, set on making India a global manufacturing hub for automobiles with the help, in this case, of large state subsidies, okay? On the other hand, it's a well-kept secret that real wages in the auto sector, after discounting for inflation, have fallen continuously in the period 2000 to 2010. Okay, the latest data that we have are from 2010. Okay, in nominal terms, wages have fallen as well in the they rose in nominal terms from 79,000 rupees in 2001 to 88,000 in 2004, okay? But the consumer price index for industrial workers, on the other hand, consistently rose more steeply. So in addition to this kind of situation in the US, this should highlight to you that this is a phenomenon with global reach, even beyond, I think, Europe and the United States, okay? It's an international phenomenon which has certain international consequences in the countries themselves, which are subjected to this kind of treatment, and also so in the countries themselves, okay? So, in addition, wages as a share of value added have been falling, okay? They've fallen from 27.4% of value added in 2000 to 15.4% of value added. So a much steeper decline than in the graph that Harry had shown you, okay? A much steeper decline. So you can think of this, I think, because I'm a little bit old school, okay? I'm a little bit old school. You can think of this in the following terms, okay? You can say that in 2000, an auto worker in India spent 2 hours and 12 minutes of an 8-hour day, okay, of an 8-hour shift, working to make enough money to sustain their family, okay? Old school in a particular sense. Those of you that got the joke know what I'm talking about, okay? The rest of the 5 hours and 48 minutes, okay, amounted to some kind of surplus which accrued to the owners of the factory, okay? So that ratio has changed dramatically over time from 2000, okay? How did this take place? It's not just a story of growing worker productivity, okay, and the ability to produce more per hour with new technology. Wages actually fell, as I mentioned above, in real terms by almost a fifth, okay? The story is very simple, okay? There's, as in the case of gold versus tourism, there's some type of what should we call it? Some sort of political uncertainty that helps determine that relationship, and sort of that political dance between these different institutional actors, okay? That political dance, I didn't do that, I promise. Okay? That political dance sort of affects especially the graph that Harry showed you, and also the Indian case. So I'm going to start wrapping up because I have only 3 minutes, okay? I have only 3 minutes. And I want to, that's a 5. Well, I'm used to 10-minute radio interviews, so this is more than enough for me. I'll stop early so that I can leave the next speaker to have a couple more extra minutes. I want to end with a poem which I think sort of will impress, I hope will impress the main idea of what I've tried to give in my lecture, or speech rather. Okay, and the poem is to impress upon you that in alternative media work, okay, it's kind of a back and forth, and in addition, in international movements against neoliberalism, okay, we've come to a stage now, I think, where the type of thing represented by the World Social Forum, which was good and I was happy to be involved in when it was at its peak, has kind of come to a close, I think, in my opinion. And we're sort of at a lull about what to do next. Sort of people of my generation have done what they can, I think. Maybe I have 10 more years in me. But to those of you that are much younger than all of us here, I'm going to read you a poem because you're the ones that have to pick this up after we're done. Okay, it's a Brecht poem, which I like very much. Okay, it goes like this. To the cities I came in a time of disorder that was ruled by hunger. I sheltered with the people in a time of uproar, and then I joined with them. That's how I passed the time that was given to me on this earth. I ate my dinners in between the battles, and I laid down to sleep among the people. I didn't care much for love and for nature's beauties. I had little patience. That's how I passed my time that was given to me on this earth. The streets all led to foul swamps in my time. My speech betrayed me to the butchers. I could do only little, but without me, those that ruled could not sleep so easily. That's what I hoped. That's how I passed the time that was given to me on this earth. Our forces were slight and small. Our goal lay in the distant future, clearly in our sights, if for me myself beyond my reaching, and that's how I passed the time that was given to me on this earth. That's it.
I don't need that. Takes a while. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. And when I was preparing this talk, I did not exactly know what my previous three presenters were going to talk about. So there was a little bit of overlapping. So I'm going to skip that part and to make this thing really short. And so two main things that I'm going to talk about today. First is the link between the neoliberalism and the neoclassical economics. And the neoclassical economics is the theoretical foundation of neoliberalism. And the second is the heterodox economics. I believe most of you guys are familiar with this term, heterodox economics. And I will highlight that this is the alternative to neoliberal and market fundamentalist economics or economic policy. That's what I'm going to talk about. And also I will, as a heterodox economist, I see that the importance of heterodox economics is its capability of finding and remedying the root causes of socioeconomic problems. Now, so here's the Robbins that Professor Henry talked about, right? 1932. This is the definition of economics that most economists take for granted. Like, economics is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends as scarce means which have alternative uses. So everybody knows that if you have taken principles of economics, right? Then I looked at the economics department at the Ohio State University and their website. I found that economics, they define it. Economics is the study of how individuals, businesses, and government make decisions and how the market mediate those decisions across a wide range of domains. Quite consistent, right? Let me show another example. The University of Chicago, economics. Economics, the study of how society allocates scarce resources, very clear. And from principles to advanced topics, classes, from preparatory courses in mathematics and statistics to research opportunities, the program strives to convey how economists reason how they analyze models and compare model implications to observations. So it's basically the model. They set up a model to explain the real world. But what they actually do is quite different. They're trying to separate economics from the reality. I will talk more about it later. So, one fundamental link between the neoliberalism and neoclassical economics. They have both, whether they are policymakers or economists and neoliberal kind, they always have a firm belief in the competitive market. It's not just market, it's competitive market. Some of you guys have learned the first welfare theorem. What is it? Does anybody remember? At about the end of the microeconomics textbook. The competitive market will lead to the Pareto optimality, which is the most efficient allocation of resources at the society level, right? You need a competitive market to achieve the maximum level of the welfare. This is how the neoclassical economics tell us. And also this competitive market, quote, behave. It's a market. They behave like a machine that generates what people want and that allocate scarce resources efficiently. This is what I know. Then, now we have the market principle represented by the law of supply and demand, and it is not like natural and universal law, right? Then, if you believe this is the law, and you have to win the competition in the marketplace to survive, right? And then, likely, you will make money. And especially for those producers and business firms, they are concerned about making money, not necessarily concerned about making goods or services. Quite different things. Also, if we believe that this is the law, then everything should be looked through the lens of market mechanism, market principles. Even our education, healthcare, everything through the market mechanism, supply and demand, right? And also if this kind of market fundamentalist economics is accepted by the public, then unregulated free market and laissez-faire economic policy are legitimized. Now, then here is a snapshot of a video created by the New Economics Institute. If you go to this link, you can find the video. Now, look at this bottom bar. The 92% of Americans think that this is the ideal wealth distribution in the United States. So about 20%, top 20% is about 30%, right? And then we have very strong middle class, and then there is a poor class as well. But this is the ideal. Now, then most Americans think that this is the current state in terms of the wealth distribution, right? Top 20% is owning about almost half, and then the other half is 80%. Is this the actual distribution of wealth in the United States? I don't think so, right? Look at this, the top bar now. This is actual, right, real. 20% owning more than 80% of the entire wealth of the nations. That's the reality, right? Now, another way of looking at this one consequence of market fundamentalist, the restructuring of the entire economy, this is the state of greenback dollars. Look at this one little guy, monster. You guys see that? This has a name, the 1%. This 1% owns 40%. This 1% owns 40%, and 20% owns more than 80% of the entire wealth. Now, so if I think that something is terribly wrong with the US economy, isn't it? Then what's wrong? Well, this is. First of all, the economic policy, regardless of the political regimes for the past 30 years, that's wrong. Something seriously wrong. And more fundamentally, the theoretical foundation of neoliberal policy is wrong and misleading. So here is a quote from Frank Ackerman. His article appeared in the Post-Autistic Economics Review. Ill-founded economic theories provide a seemingly scientific rationale for doing the wrong thing. Right? Let's take the law of supply and demand as an example of ill-founded theory. Here is the question. Is the law of supply and demand the universal principle that coordinates all economic activities and events under capitalism? That's my question to you. Think about it. Now, look at this chart. I got it from the Center for American Progress report 2012. The top, this red line, is the aggregate annual gasoline price from starting from 2006 and 2011. And the bottom blue line is the supply of gasoline by big five oil companies in the United States. Like BP, right? British Petroleum, and then Exxon Mobil, and Chevron, and ConocoPhillips, and what's the last one? Shell, right? Law of supply, what I said, there should be the structural and positive relationship between the price and quantity supplied. Do you see that relationship here? Exactly opposite way. When the price goes up, the supply goes down. When the price goes up, supply goes down. But exactly the opposite, right? Isn't it? Then, what's happening in the oil industry or gasoline industry, whatever you call it? Some fact. Every 1 cent increase in gasoline price yields $200 million in profit on a quarterly basis for the largest oil companies. And, well, let's go back. Also, you can see that those big five oil companies are controlling the quantity. At the same time, they're controlling the price of the oil. And there's an additional player here in the oil industry. These guys, the Wall Street speculators. And they're speculating on gasoline. And according to an empirical study, this speculation drives up the gasoline prices up to $1 per gallon. So you're paying about $3.51 at the pump now. That's what I saw this morning, right? And about $1 is just because of speculations. And also you pay tax, and remaining goes to all the oil companies. The point here is that, well, the law of supply and demand does not explain what's happening in the oil market, right? Do not blame China or India for the increase in the global oil price. That's what you're hearing every day through the newspapers and media. It's because of those companies, oil companies, they're controlling the price, right? It's not just because of the increasing demand in somewhere in China. No. So I'm not going to go over the theoretical, the fallacies in neoclassical economics, but let me just say that it is just an illusion of the epoch, using the John Henley's word. He's not here now. And he wrote a very interesting article, The Illusion of the Epoch, the neoclassical economics as a case study. If you have time, take a look at it. Very interesting. And then, to preserve their illusions, neoclassical economists have found it increasingly necessary to isolate themselves from non-believers. One way to do so is using mathematics and econometrics, right? Now, another aspect of the rise to dominance of neoliberalism is its impact on academia, especially the teaching of economics. There have been lots of attacks on the pluralism in economics. Rutgers, like 1980s, at that time, the Rutgers University was famous for the post-Keynesian economics. General post-Keynesian economics was established by those people at the Rutgers University, and they're gone. Now, recently, the University of Notre Dame, the Heterodox economics department was shut down, and now only neoclassical economics department remains. And also, if you look at the economics journals, you always see the neoclassical economics, nothing else. Then what is taught? Only neoclassical economics and self-interested, individual, rational choices. All models are based on that kind of ideas. And the law of supply and demand and mathematics and econometrics. Then what is dismissed? Marx. We don't learn Marx in the principles of economics class, right? We don't learn Veblen or even true Keynes, but of course you learn some Keynesian economics, but that's not true Keynes. And we don't learn the history or history of economic thought. We don't learn methodology and philosophy. So we have lost very rich the pluralistic tradition in economics, especially for the past 30 years. Then, also, there was a very interesting study done by, I believe they were neoclassical economists, right? According to their study, economic students are more likely to free ride than others. And students are less likely to return found money after studying economics, but not after studying another subject like astronomy. Really, there was an empirical study. And another, economists are less generous than other academics in charitable giving. So the question is, are they selfish bastards? You can answer that question. Then, well, there is an alternative way to look at the economy, our economic conditions, and that's what I call the heterodox economics, including the Marxians and post-Keynesians, institutionalists and feminists and radical political economists. And then, in general, the general agenda for the heterodox economics is like this. It is the study of ongoing and evolving and instituted social provisioning process. The consumption behavior is explained through the social relations. If you want to know about that kind of argument, ask Professor Todorova. She did lots of studies, the works around that theme. And also production, investment, financing. You can, or they have different explanations, I would say more realistic explanations about those economic activities. And Wright State University economics program, I found you guys are very different, right? Yes. Compare this with the Ohio State University and the University of Chicago. Economics, the study of how resources are used and how to make the best, not necessarily the optimal, I assume, the best use of available resources. And economic students learn to make decisions that are vital to the success of businesses and nonprofits and government agencies and households and for society as a whole. I think this is the view that your professors have. Now, this is the view you are supposed to learn. And I believe you guys are quite lucky to be in this distinctive program. Not many programs. According to the current edition of Heterodox Economics Directory, you can find it here, that link. There are 38 active heterodox economics associations around the world, like the Association for Heterodox Economics, and the Australian Society of Heterodox Economists, and Union for Radical Political Economics, and Association for Evolutionary Economics, Association for Social Economics, and then Association for Institutional Thought, a lot of, right? Their heterodox economics is alive and well. And also there are 61 graduate and 60 undergraduate programs, including the Wright State University, and 159 heterodox economics journals, and the over 4,800 the subscribers of the Heterodox Economics newsletter that I'm editing now. So if you're interested in this, yes, go to the website and look at what those heterodox economists are doing, right? Where are the heterodox economics programs located? Take a look at them. Now, what you are seeing here is that there has been a series of student movements around the world. And recently, well, not quite recent, in 2000, in Paris, students petitioned calling for the reform of their economics curriculum. Let me just quote this. Neoclassical economics is supposed to explain everything by means of purely axiomatic process, as if this were the economic truth. We do not accept this dogmatism. We want a pluralism of approaches. Very clear argument. And also went on to the Cambridge, the UK. And they were making very similar argument. And also in the Kansas City, 2001. And recently, we have two events. One is what they called the Kick It Over movement, or Kick It Over manifesto. Let me just read this very interesting quote. You, the teachers of neoclassical economics, and the student that you graduate, have perpetuated a gigantic fraud upon the world. You claim to work in a pure science of formula and law, but yours is a social science with all the fragility and uncertainty that this entails. We accuse you of pretending to be what you are not. So this movement is still ongoing. You can find it there. Now, recently also, many of you guys are aware of this, the Harvard and Greg Menkew's class workout. And they're saying that, student, we are working out of your class, Economics 10, in order to express our discontent with the bias inherent in this introductory economics course. We are deeply concerned about the way that this bias affects students and the university and our greater society. So now many students around the world are recognizing the problems in the economics and economics curriculum. More importantly, the problems underlying many socioeconomic problems, right? Then, 5 minutes? I think this is actually the last slide.
You actually have more than 5 minutes.
All right. So, in conclusion, let me give you some advice, and just general advice that probably most of you guys know. First, read broadly and think critically and challenge the conventional wisdoms if possible. I think probably that's the most important thing when you are studying economics. Right? Now, this is a quote from my favorite living heterodox economist, Fred Lee. Knowing about wrong theories helps knowing right theories. So learn both neoclassical economics and heterodox economics. And it's your judgment. You make a choice, right? When you're facing real economic problems, you may rely on some theoretical approaches. And you can make a judgment which one is more relevant in solving your real problems. Now, a quote from my favorite female heterodox economist, Joan Robinson, very famous quote. The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. Now, lastly, there was a very short quote from a Korean heterodox economist who died a few years ago. Remember, your heart is on the left side of your chest with an emphasis on here, left, right? Thank you.
Questions? Do we have a mic floating around somewhere?
I have a quick question for Professor Joe. On the chart you showed with the oil supply and price, to me it all seemed to make sense. We would expect supply and price to move inversely. I was wondering if you could maybe clear up why the chart was showing what we shouldn't expect.
Okay.
Because again, to me, it would just seem natural that if the supply went down, the price would go up.
Want me to answer?
Yeah, because we don't have any other.
Where is it? Oh, this one. Okay. So basically, the supply curve, it is over the sloping curve given the quantity supply and the price of a product, right? And now, then, that low supply clearly says that there should be a positive and should be functional relationship between price and quantity, right? Then, what this chart shows is there's a negative, actually, relationship. Oh, this is what the chart says. Then your customers, this chart, and
Yes, that's the relationship I would expect. If quantity decreases, I would expect the price to rise. I was wondering why that would be wrong. Or
this is the price and this is the quantity. The quantity increase, price goes down.
I think I can help clear that up a little bit.
all right.
You missed the part where he emphasized that it's not the increased demand of China and India that's causing this rise of price. If that's what happened, that you have, demand is shifting to the right. We'd be moving along, what we'd be seeing in terms of the pattern of how equilibrium is changing would be moving along the supply curve, and you'd see increases, which is not what you're seeing. What you're seeing here is shifts of supply that are moving along a demand curve. Okay, and so you can't explain what's going on in the market there by these increases in demand of China and India. What you can explain it with is speculation. That's the point that he was making.
So if you want to explain how price changes or how quantity supply changes in the oil market, that this is probably not enough. You have to look at what's happening in that market. So that's why I brought up that speculation on oil, and also I brought up those control of gasoline or oils by those big suppliers. Okay?
Additional questions?
So heterodox economics, studying from the non-orthodox perspective, is going. Sorry, I thought I had been trying to constrict it. But as far as it is, my understanding of it is utilizing Vellman and looking to other kind of non-orthodox methodologies. What would be the consequence? And what is, say, the political ramifications? What is your take on what should be done, in normative kind of view, and how is that perspective going to be done? Because you do have vested interests, you do have large corporations with fairly large power as far as everything getting done into a political sphere. What's the answer?
Question to me?
Yeah.
You respond.
I can say something.
Okay. Well, first of all, what do I say? So we start from, the starting points are different. Let's say the mainstream neoclassical economics begins with a set of assumptions. Right? That's how you have the demand curve and supply curve. There's quite a logical consequence. But now, if you're following the heterodox economics, you do not start with a set of assumptions. Let's take a look at what's happening, right? Now, based on that, the real observation, and we may end up with some different theories, and that may help to forming the alternative economic policies. So there will be a lot of the economic and also the social consequences of having different approaches. Does this help your? You want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think it's sort of a slow-moving process to some degree, and I think that people sort of there's no sort of grand plan. People sort of trudge through the mud according to their situation. I think so, and I think people take up different projects to deal with the situation. I think alternative media projects are one aspect of that. I think other than that, there's also people sort of doing important legal work and dealing with this kind of thing. So lawyers taking up cases which sort of can keep the dam up a little bit longer, if you like to use a metaphor. There's lots of legal cases pending like this. So for example, there was a recent case in India against Novartis with respect to drug patents. So there's that kind of thing happening as well. There's no sort of, I don't think there's any kind of grand scheme to be implemented as such. It's just people working in their organizational space to do different things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Regarding the model of journalism you proposed, it's a very different model from the media model. You know, which model? The media. And so the model that you described, the model of journalism you described, is very different from the media model. And I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on what you see the shortcomings of the media model, where everybody can basically contribute, every active participant can actually contribute in terms of the information. How this, whether you think this has exhausted its potential, right? Because what you guys are offering is more analysis rather than just, go out to this demonstration. There's something happening there. What do you see the benefits and the shortcomings of its model?
Yeah. So I mean, the only India media model that I'm familiar with is India Media Athens. So I'll comment on that. I think India Media Athens, it's useful in the sense that it's quite helpful to have people there when events are happening to shoot things off like tweets or to inform others via SMS about what is going on. Sort of what's the immediate thing, news on the street type of discussion or headline, if you wish. The intermediate issue, difficulty, I think, sort of it doesn't take into account. It sort of wants to believe that everyone can contribute equally to a particular media project. When, in point of fact, unfortunately, there's some group of people which sort of exercise some kind of editorial discretion about what becomes the headline or what does not become the headline. And I think that that's the main failing of the Athens media model, is that that's sort of put under the rug in some way. Whereas the model that we were working with, first of all, it was a much smaller group of people, like 10, let's say, for the Winter Has Its End collective, the one that we're familiar with. So I think in our situation, we had a more explicit type of procedure in terms of voting for what would become approved or not. There was more discussion was involved, and we voted to sort of allocate people to editorial positions as well. So it was a clearer process than the indie media process, where someone ends up being on top because they're louder for the most part.
This question's for Taki. When you talked about indie media, one of the reasons, not indie media, the alternative media sites that you're associated with, one of the aspects, of course, is that news channels and news media doesn't offer that kind of analysis. But the other thing that the two projects that you were involved with, it also played a role in sort of not just sort of, in highlighting people's movements against the market, but also against state repression.
Right.
So could you then talk about how alternative media, sort of following up on Harry's question, how it can also, so it's not just about, market versus state, or some sort of conception of this very false dichotomy of market and state, but in what way does do movements against neoliberalism offer a very different conceptualization of what the alternatives could be, and what role does alternative media play in that?
Right. So, right, I didn't answer that second part of the question. So I think there's two components also related to Sanisha's question. At least for Shanati, there's a news, we have an explicit news part of the website, and we have an explicit theoretical part of the website. So in the news part of the website, we accept things like press releases from people. We accept things like statements. We accept sort of news submissions for someone who's a grassroots journalist. And that has a very important place. But there's also the theoretical place, which is intended to sort of try and take some lessons from that. And we accept that there's some kind of division between those two. And so we don't try and play one off the other and say, oh, this one is just academic and impractical, and the other one is sort of more focused on movements. We try to integrate those two in a more specific kind of way. So that's sort of what I think sets us apart from a lot of, like happens in the media, right? You'll never find any kind of theoretical article that happens in the media. It won't happen. Because it's sort of, I mean, there's no real concrete explanation that I can give beyond that they think it's about them. They're about that kind of thing, right? And we sort of don't take that kind of approach. Could you tell me the question one more time? Did I answer your question? I had to go back to Harry.
No. State versus market.
State versus
So
market.
what, both in terms of movements, but also in terms of alternatives to, alternative media, what role does, you talk a little bit about that state versus market dichotomy, which
Yeah,
is
state.
false.
Yeah, it's false. I mean, I don't think there's anything. There's a state versus market dichotomy. Of course, I think heterodox economists have known for some time that the state, very importantly, constitutes the market in some particular sense. And what we try and do, in terms of our news reportage, at least, is sort of highlight all the different aspects of social reality in which the state will intervene. So the state may intervene, as Harry showed, to sort of clear people from their land because some gold mining company wants access to the land. The state may intervene in other ways, which are more subtle as well, which may not necessarily consist of a state versus market kind of dichotomy. So I think we try and highlight sort of the varieties of actions that the state can take, varieties of action, and in favor of the market as well. In favor of the market as well.
So I was thinking about the connections between conventional media, and of course your effort, Taki, to deal with that, and also conventional wisdom that comes out of economic theory. I mean, even this last example about state versus market, this is not coming out of nowhere. I mean, people don't just conceive that, right? This is actually can be traced back to standard economic theory. We do think of the state is intervening somehow and meddling of the market. And of course we know, as you pointed out, that this is a specific theory. So what connection, and perhaps both of you can answer, what connection could you see between economic theory and what conventional wisdom we see, for example, in the media? And it will be interesting for me to see from both of your perspective. Like, for example, what do you, Taki, think about just dealing with an alternative media going beyond the discourse of what is accepted as a conventional wisdom? And also, perhaps, Taki, what do you think trickles from conventional theory into everyday understanding of people Does this make more difficult to actually engage in more popular discussions with people about economic issues?
Sorry. Okay. One of the conventional wisdoms we often find in the media is like this. What is good for the private company is good for the entire public, right? But that's not quite correct, because what this underlying this kind of wisdom is that when the business companies are making their profit and it will add to the increase in GDP or income in some sense, that was assumed but not likely, or if we look at what's happening in the real world. Now, then, let's get back to that issue between the state and market. Now, private companies need an orderly market. There should be some kind of order in the market to do their business and to survive in the long period. Then, so that's why the private companies organize themselves. So we have lots of associations in probably almost all markets, like trade associations or even cartels. And that's not enough for the private companies to survive. They always still need that the government or the state in general and this government sets up all kinds of rules, and sometimes the private companies require the government to set that kind of rules. And then there is a market. So market cannot be separated from the state. So this is quite different story. We do not hear from our conventional textbooks. Right? So from heterodox perspective, what is important is that who's controlling the price and who's controlling the quantity, how those private companies are organizing themselves. We need to explain them to talk about that particular product and its supply and demand. It's not just the price and quantity.
So if I can just repeat your question to make sure that I understood. Your question pertained to what is the impact of economic theory on popular narratives in the media about economic questions? Was that-
You get over that if you want to construct an alternative conventional wisdom, if you will.
Oh, I I don't have any, again, a grand theory to offer, but I think as an editor, what you have to do is you have to take a very hard line. And your hard line has to be that you have plenty of outlets to sort of have this kind of discussion, and we don't support that kind of thing. You can go anywhere else, and we're not going to publish that. And I hate to be so practical, but I think that's a very concrete decision that one has to make to say that, look, you have plenty of spaces to publish this kind of discussion, and our space is not one of those. We support heterodox approaches, alternative thinking, and so forth, and those types of discussions. Like recently we published an article about inclusive growth in India. So we encourage those kinds of articles, sort of that kind of dodge, that are not within the mainstream, and we accept those, and we just don't accept others. I think that's the only way to really deal with that, in my opinion.
Well, if there's no more questions, we'll take a break. When do we come back for the roundtable? Coffee, and come back at 5 o'clock for the roundtable.